Shavua Tov. Today's daf is daf Pei Dal. So we'll start with the Mishnah on the top of daf Pei Dal. This Mishnah is going to address the question of which parts of the Korban Pesach you can eat in order to fulfill your mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach. Kol Hanechal Bishar HaGadol. So we use the model in order to determine whether the meat that we're eating of the lamb or the kid is edible. And the model is going to be the Shar HaGadol. And the ox has different parts of meat. Some part are very tough and they're not edible. So if it's Nechal B'Shar HaGadol, if that part of the animal could be eaten in the case of a shar, then it's parallel in the case of a Korban Pesach can likewise be eaten. And with that, we will fulfill our mitzvah of the Korban Pesach. And Gdi Arach means that the age for this Gdi, for this kid, to be roy for the Achila of Korban Pesach is from 8 days on, when it's very young, until it reaches a year old. So during that age, so any basar that could be edible in a Shar HaGadol is kosher as far as the mitzvah of a Achilas Korban Pesach of a kid. And that means that if, on the other hand, it's not edible in a Shar HaGadol, it's too tough of meat that you wouldn't eat it, you can't get it down, then it's parallel in a goat or kid, in this case, because it's very young, is the Gdi Arach would not fulfill the mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach. Now, we have to add one important point here, which will help us in the sugya. Rashi already pointed out up front, that in this case, the Mishnah mentions and emphasizes that the Gdi is rach, it's soft, because right now, the Gdi is very young. When it matures, those parts of the organ, those organs will be so tough, they're not edible. And you can't eat them now, they're excluded, they're on the no list, even though right now they are edible, because sofo lahakshos, they will get very tough when the Gdi matures. B'roshei knafayim, be'haschusim. So these are certain cartridges in the animal, and at the top of the knafayim is these are considered edible. These can be eaten. Rabba Rami. Rabba asks a fine question. Tonight we have a Mishnah, our Mishnah. It implies that she'eno u'she'eno nechal, if it cannot be eaten in the Gdi, in the Shar Gadol, then lo, you cannot eat it now. Emot Seifa. Roshei knafayim v'aschusim. These are parts of the, like we said before, cartridges in the animal on the top of the spinal column and so forth. And these can be eaten in a young goat, a young kid, as we said, a rach, a Gdi rach. And the Mishnah says that this is part of the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. For example, if we want to gather together as one chabura with one single minui, and we want to dedicate a certain part of the animal for Reuven, for Shimon, for Levi, so Levi ended up with this part of the animal, as recorded in the Sefer of Mishnah, and he's Yotzei. Bahani lo misachli b'shar gadol. But these kinds of cartridges of the animal and the tops of the spinal column, they cannot be eaten in a shar gadol. Impossible. Now, I said that this was located near the spinal column. It's actually near the shoulder blades, to be more precise. And perhaps it's on the bottom of the shoulder blades, but it's cartilage, it's not edible in a shar gadol. And the question now is a fundamental one. What do you have something that's edible now, but sofo lahakshos? And Rabba presents here a contradiction between the Reish and the Seifa. And he answers Elatanoihi. Actually, the Reish and the Seifa represent two different shitos that debate this issue. You have to add here two words to the Mishnah. Kol hanechal b'shar gadol ye'achal b'gdi arach v'she'eno nechal lo. So that's the Tanakama. And the emphasis here is, would it be eaten as is now when the kid is very young? Yesh omrim af roshe knafayim vaschusim. So it works like this. The Tanakama says, Kol shenechal b'shar hagadol. It's not enough that right now you could eat. The Yesh Omrim says, Af Roshe Knafayim Vaschusim, which in the case of a Shar Gadol cannot be eaten, so that the Yesh Omrim in the Seifa represent the Kula, offering a broader scope of what is considered part of the Basar that's Nechal, that lends self to Achila, whereas the Tanakama emphasizes the Nechal B'Shar Gadol. What's going to be later on, because in a Shar Gadol, we're already looking at a mature Shar. And these parts, which the Yesh Omrim add, would not be edible in a mature Shar. Now, in terms of the Yesh Omrim, who expand the scope of what you can eat in Biyotze, the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, what we have is something which apparently could be eaten, even in the case of a Shar Gadol, if you do what's called shlika. Shlika is a long process of bishul. And over that long period of time, the meat becomes edible, becomes soft. And the Tanakama holds that the fact that it's nechal through a process of bishul, that's not enough to give it the status of kosher for the mitzvah of achilas haPesach. Whereas the Yesh Omrim are of the opinion that the very fact that even when it becomes a Shara Gadol, you could take these parts, the shoulder blades and the cartridges, and you can cook them for a long time and they will become edible. That's enough to make it a nechal even now. Rava offers an alternative answer. Ma hein ktani. Let's read the Mishnah, adding the words ma hein. Here's what it says in the Mishnah. Kol shenechal b'shara gadol b'shilka. Anything that could be eaten in a mature ox, a part of the body that if you cook it over and over again for a long period of time, it can be edible. Ye'achel b'gdi arach b'tzli. That segment of the body in its parallel in a gdi, which is going to be roasted for the purpose of the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, is considered royal achila. Umahen, and here we add these two words. What are the examples of something which in and of themselves, in the case of a mature shar, would not be edible, but after a long process of shlika, they become edible? And that's what the Sefer adds here, Roshe Knofayim Vaskusim. Those cartridges and parts of the blades of the shoulders, they can be cooked for a long time and made edible. Tanya Kavose de Rava. Gemara now quotes a Bryce to support. Rava kol anechal b'shara gadol b'shilka. Anything through shlika, that's this long extended process of bishul, and make something edible that normally without that process of bishul would not be considered edible, is considered a viable achila for the Korban Pesach. And therefore, the Brisa continues and says, and what do we have in mind? And the Brisa gets very specific and mentions Roshe Knafayim Vaschus. The Brisa continues with another chidush. The gidin harachin nidonim kibasar, and the sinews that are soft in the Korban Pesach are considered like basar. We can gather together and designate that Ruvain in this minui and this chabura will eat the gidin because they're soft gidin, and that's fine for the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. Now the Gemara wants to know about gidin that might be soft now, but ultimately, as time passes, they get tough, they get hard. And that's going to be a machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Itmar. We learned the following: Gidin shesofan lehikoshos, especially the sinews around the neck. Now they might be soft, but ultimately they get very tough. Reish Lakish Amar ein nibnin aleh. You cannot designate them for the achila of so and so who wants to join the minui, because although right now these gidin are edible, but ultimately they will become so tough that they won't be edible. And that's the shita of Reish Lakish. We judge b'shem sofa. And Rabbi Yochanan Amar nibdim aleim b'tzar hashtaz lina. Rabbi Yochanan's of the opinion that right now it's soft. These are soft sinews. Even though they're from the neck, they will become harder later, but now they're soft and edible. That's enough for allowing a valid minui, and it's considered nechal as far as the mitzvah of Korban Pesach is concerned. We have a brayso that says kol hanechal b'shar gol ye'achal b'gdiya rach umahen roshe knafayim vaschusin. In other words, he has the way we saw Rava before with the words umahen, but the mahen is a limiting phrase, and it's telling you that what is considered nechal b'shar hagadol, and therefore it's kosher from Pesach, and that means with shlika we can soften it up. That's only mahen roshe knafayim vaschusin. So Reish Lakish learns this brayso meticulously. He says, "Hani in aval gidin shesofan likoshos lo." The Mishnah went out of its way, or this brayso, I should say, to limit the nechal of shlika, of some long process of bishul, to these cases of cartilage. Apparently, as far as sinews are concerned, that's not included. Amalei Rabbi Yochanan says to Reish Lakish, Tana hachi. This is the way the Tana should be read. But who had been lahana? It's not an exhaustive list. The Bryce is not telling you, oh, the following are sofo li koshos, but yet they're kosher because right now they're soft. And Rabbi Yochanan Chita is that it all depends upon hashta. What's the status now? But the Bryce rather chose to give two examples, and we can be makish, we can equate by analogy other cases like Gidin that are sofo lahakshos, but right now they're edible, and we can use them as they are basar hashtaz linon for the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. So that which Reish Lakish says, Aval Gidin shesofo l'koshos lo, Rav Yochanan responds, no. Who adin lahanach? V'hani my timer. And you might ask, why is that knafayim and schusim are nechal b'gdiya rach? And the answer is, because even in the case of a mature ox, these cartilages, or the part of the shoulder blades, once you heat them up for a long time, they cook, they become edible. And therefore, it's considered misachle b'shar hagadol b'shilka. Through shlika, it will be edible. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah Rav Ovin ki azlis lekami Rabbi Avo Rami lay. Please, when you appear in front of Rabbi Avo, take the opportunity to ask him the following stira, the following contradiction. Mi Amar Rabbi Yochanan, is it true, as our tradition has it, that Rabbi Yochanan holds that gidin, in the case of sinews, shesofan likoshos, even though they will, with the passage and the maturity process, they will get hard. Nimnim aleim b'Pesach. And why is that? Because even though it's sofan likoshos, but nevertheless, right now, Asheru Sham, the present reality is that it's edible. And Alma Basar Hashtaz Lina, we go by the situation as it is present. Boy mine, but wait a second, I have a story for you. Reish Lakish asked Rabbi Yochanan, or Haroshal Egel Rach. So you have a young calf, and we're no longer dealing with Korban Pesach. We're stretching our arm out to another area of halacha, and that is Tumas Ochel. So the head of a calf, which is young, and it's edible. Maushi Yitame, meaning Betumas Ochel. Is it called an Ochel? One hand, it's right now soft, it's young, and in this present state, it's edible. It should have a Shem Ochel. But on the other hand, it's so full of hakshas. The kashas, it will eventually, with maturity, it becomes very tough and very unedible. The Omar Lo, and Rabbi Yochanan responds to Reish Lakish's query, said, Ein mitame. It's not subject to Tumas Ochel, meaning he's looking at the future and it's so full of hakshas. Alma Bosa V'Sofazli. How do we reconcile that with our statement here that we quoted earlier? The tradition has that the Rabbi Yochanan held that we don't look at Tofel Haktus, we look at Basar Hashtaz, even right now. Amalei. So at this point, Rabbi Avo turns to Rabbi Oven in response. He says, the Ramalacha, why do you ask such a question? Anyone who asks such a question, he's not looking for good flour, healthy kemach, healthy flour. And that's a way of saying that, giving him a shtuck, saying that, if you would have given a little bit more thought and crush it down, like we grind grains in order to create a fine flour, then you wouldn't have even asked your question. A Hadar Bey, Rabbi Yochanan, Legabi Reish Lakish. We know, and we'll prove it now, that in the machlokas between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan took a stand regarding Gidin, that even though it's Sofel HaHakshos, Basar Hashtaz Lina, and therefore they're considered Ochel, and you can fulfill the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. And when Rabbi Yochanan responded to Reish Lakish, he told him that our Harashal Egel Arach is not Mekabel to Masochel. And the reason for that is because it's so full of hakshas. So we see from the give and take between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish with regard to Rosh Egel Halach, that Rabbi Yochanan is on the same page as Reish Lakish. And he's looking at the future. And since it's so full of hakshos, it's not an ochel, it's not mitami tumas ochel. And its analogy to our Korban Pesach would be that it cannot be eaten as a Korban Pesach because it's so full of hakshos. So now at that point, Reish Lakish asks Rabbi Yochanan from an explicit Mishnah in Chulin, Kuf Chav Beis, that indicates that the R of the rush of the Egel Harach is Basa, as far as Tumas Ochlin is concerned. The Omar Le, and this is the objection raised by Reish Lakish, and now Rabbi Yochanan responds to Reish Lakish, Al Takniteni, don't ask me a kash from that Mishnah, Shebeloshen Yochid Anishona Osa. That Mishnah, in my opinion, reflects a Das Yochid, a dissenting view, when he says that the R of the rush of an Egel Arach is Lidon Kibasar. That's a single person, one single Tana. But the Chachamim, the preponderant majority of the Chachamim, they disagree. They hold that it's not considered Basar. As we said before, it's not Mitami Ochlin, Tumas Ochlin, because it's so full of hakshas. It's going to get hard. So we see that Rabbi Yochanan changed his mind and he agreed to Reish Lakish. He accepted Reish Lakish's view. And with regard to Gidin, since these sinews will eventually get hard, then we look at their situation down the line, and we're not going to be machshir for the minui of a Korban Pesach. It's not part of the Korban Pesach. So in other words, when you quoted this Mishnah in Chulin regarding the or of an Egel Rach, or the or of the rush of the Egel Rach, that it is Makabel Tumas Ochlin, even though it's Sofal HaKoshot, that's only representative, says Rabbi Yochanan, of the minority opinion, a dissenting view. But we accept the opinion of the Chachamim, the preponderant 99.9% of the agreement of the Chachamim. They held that if it's Sofal HaHakros, it's not Makabel Tumas Ochlin. And by its parallel, in the case of those parts of the Korban Pesach which are Sofal HaHakros, they are disqualified as far as oath. And now we start the Mishnah here, 2/3 the way down on Peidal. This Mishnah is going to address the issue of Shviras Etzem, of breaking a bone, and also something called Mosir. Hashover Etzem Pesach Hatorah Reza Lokar Boy, he who violates this law of Etzem Lo Tishbrubo, and he breaks the bone of a kosher and a pure, uncontaminated Korban Pesach, gets Malchus. Why? Because the Torah says, as we said before, Etzem Lo Tishbrubo, Avol HaMosir Min HaPesach. What about parts of the basar, of the flesh of the lamb, after the entire enterprise of Achilas Korban Pesach has passed? And even if it's a tar, Hashover b'Pesach. I'm sorry, even if it's a tar, that's case number one. And case number two is Hashover Etzem b'Pesach Tameh Eno Loke Es Harboim. And it means that if he left over part of the Korban Pesach, that's called Motzir, or if he breaks the bone of a Korban Pesach that had contracted tumah, in these cases, there's no Malchus. So we'll see the Gemara. Bishlema Mosir Bator. If you ask me to explain the exoneration from Malchus in the case of Mosir, that I understand. The Sanya we learned in a Brisa. It says in the Apostle, so Siru Mimenu Ad Boker. Fanos Mimenu Ad Boker HT Sorev. Because of Litain Esse Achar Losas. So even if you violate the Isur Nosar by leaving the boss of the carbon beyond its allotted time for Achila, you do not get Malchus. Why? Because by Eish Tisrof was a positive command which sets up a Nitakli essay on the lav becomes a lav Nitakli essay. In other words, the Torah is telling us, don't leave no sorrow. And if you leave nosar over, you're commanded to rectify the situation by burning the nosar. That's called a lav hanitak le'eser. And you don't get Malchus, so that's fine. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So again, what we have is two cases mentioned in the Mishnah, and one is Moser Mipsar Pesach Loka, even in a carbon tar. And that one I understand because Moser means he didn't eat the carbon, which is tar. And he violated the essay, I should say the los essay of Lo Tasira Min Ad Boker, but the Torah gave him an essay to rectify this, and that's by HT Sarek. And now I understand that a Moser Bitar is Eino Loka. He doesn't get Malchus because Salav Hanitakles. Because of Litain Essay Achar Al Losase, Lomar Lechoshe Ein Loka. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yaakov Omer, Lo Min Hashem Huzeh. I agree with you that the Mosir is potter from Malchus, but not for the reason that you gave. El Mishum Dehavi Lelav Sheimo Maisa, being local. we don't give Malchus for passivity. And since he passively left over the boss until it became Notsar, he didn't do anything active to make it Notsar. Therefore, he gets no Malchus. Ella shover betome minoa. What's the source that if you're allowed to break the bones of a carbon tome? They brought the carbon, and now you're breaking its bones. So Gemara answers the Omar Krav, the etzem lo sishru bo. The word bo, which is superfluous, is always considered a mute. Bo. So what are we going to derive from bo? Bo be kosher, v'lo b'posel. That when the Torah prohibits breaking a bone, it's only referring to a carbon pesach that's tar, but not to one that is tum. Tana Rabbanu, we learned in the Brisa, etz v'etzem lo sishru bo. Bo becoming kosher, v'lo b'posel. So that's what we said until now. And this is the Tanakama of the Bryce. But Rebbe Omer, Rebbe says that when you're talking about a carbon kosher, we're not going to derive it from the word bo and use bo to limit kosher for this lav of etzem lo sishbu to exclude a apostle, but rather the pasuk says b'bayis echad ye'ochel v'etzem lo sishbu bo. So in this pasuk we see that achilas haPesach is elevated to the iser of shvius etzem. In other words, both are together in one sentence, in one verse. And what is this teaching us? All haroy lachila. Right? It says b'bayis echad ye'ochel. It's roy lachila. And then it says, Etzem lo sishbu yeshbo shum shviras etzem. Now, this carbon that's royal achila is now included in the Etzem lo sishbu, the law. But ain't a royal achila, if the carbon pesach, for whatever reason, is not edible, ain't bo mishum shviras etzem. My beinayu, what's the difference between the Tanakama and Rebbe? Rabbi Yirmiyah Pesach habo betuma ika beinayu. Let's say Rov Yisrael atmeim, so they bring the Pesach betuma, and now they have they leave over extra meat from the carbon Pesach. But again, keep in mind the Pesach is tamei. Is lamandi Omar, according to the Tanakama, who says that the Torah never prohibited shviras etzem unless it's a carbon kosher, is high. Here on the top of Pei Daladum and Beis, this carbon which is brought betuma, rov kol tmeim, possible. Now he's holding now tuma dechuya b'tzibur. Basically, the carbon is possible, but we have a special halacha of ritzui tzitz, or perhaps just the fact that the carbon is a carbon tzibur. Is lamadium, according to Rebbe, in this particular case, roy lachila. It is edible, correct? And hainami roy lachilo. Just like in the case of Rebbe, which we had here in the Brisa, of a carbon pesach that contracted tumah, is Rebbe holds that the Isa Shvira depends upon whether the carbon is roy lachilo or not. And this carbon, which is coming betuma, nami roy lachila, because as opposed to any other carbon tzibur that's brought betuma, which cannot be eaten, carbon pesach is the exception to the rule. So since it can be eaten, therefore there's an isur lav of shviras etzem. That's the shita of Rabbi Yochanan. And therefore, we're going now with the understanding that according to Rebbe, when Rebbe says roy lachili yeshbo mishum shviras etzem, a carbon pesach that's brought betuma, paradoxically, even though it's tamei, it will be eaten. And once it's going to be eaten, then there's an isur that automatically kicks in of etzem lo sijbru. So again, what's the emphasis here on the fact that the carbon itself is tamei? Because although Rebbe would say it's royal achila, because again a carbon that's Pesach that's brought betum, it's royal achila, it's edible, and high is royal achila, and therefore there'd be an isur lav. But if we go back to the Tanakama sheet, the Tanakama says bo means it's got to be a carbon that's kosher below bipsul, and the permission to bring this carbon Pesach, because rov kol tmeim, is to bring a carbon Pesach that's possible. And then afkamina is that there won't be an Isur according to Tanakama of the etzem lo sijbru.